We're learning the first Sikha of Purim in Chelek Tazayim, page 352. This is quite a long Sikha here. The Sikha has no less than 20 Isiyas. The Sikha, you can say, is divided in three parts. The Sikha will be explaining in the beginning, the first part, Mordechai and Esther and Purim. Their role they played in the Gzeira and in the Ness of Purim, and regarding establishing the Yontif of Purim. And then the Rebbe explains Mordechai and Esther al pi Chassidus, al pi Kabbalah, and their role in Purim. And in the last Chelek of the Sikha, the Rebbe will explain the first halacha in Shulchan Aruch, in the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch, and in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, based on a point here connected to Esther. So let's begin. The Gemara sagt in Megillah, the Gemara tells us in the Megillah as follows. Sholcha lahem Esther l'chachamim. Esther sent the following request to the Chachamim. Kav'uni l'dairis. Establish for me this Purim as a Yom Tov forever. Esther hat gebeten, men soll kevei sein Yedaldu tezvav ader li Yom Tov u'lekriya liyais li l'shem. She requested to establish Purim as a Yom Tov to read the Megillah, and it should be for me for an everlasting name. Noch bringt die Gemara zweiten Maimer in dem. Then there's another request that Esther made. Sholchalem Esther l'chachamim kesvuni l'deiris. Write forever, for all generations, the story of Purim. Esther hat gebeten, as man soll in Megillah, was es auf ihr Namen, verschreiben im Shar Ksuvim. That it should be written. Megillah's Esther should be written and be one of the Ksuvim, one of the Chavdalat Sifrei Kodesh being as part of the Ksuvim. It's another request that she made regarding writing the Megillah as a Megillah. So das heißt, the two requests of Esther are as follows. Frier hat sie noch gebeten kav'uni l'deiris. Her first request was that it should be established for all generations, l'yom tov v'lekriya. So she's asking it should be established as a Yom Tov, and she's also asking that we should be reading the story of the Ness of Purim. Man soll jedes Jahr leinen dem Sippel von Purim. Every year we should tell the story of Purim. Es muss aber nicht gelernt werden mitoch haksav. However, in her first request, she doesn't include that it has to be written and therefore read from the Megillah, from the ksav of the Megillah that's written. We should tell the story of Purim every single year as part of the celebration of the Yom Tov. Danach hat sie gebeten, als die Megillah soll werden verschrieben ledeiris und sein a Chelek von Ksuvim. The second request was, she asked that it should actually be written and it should be one of the Ksuvim. And therefore the Megillah has to be read from the actual Ksav of the Megillah itself. And if you read the Megillah and you say the story without reading it from inside the Megillah itself, you're not Yaitze. The mitzvah is to read it from the Megillah itself. So those are the two details of the request that Esther made. That it should be read, l'kriya, it should be established as a Yom Tov to read the Megillah, and it should be read from the actual Megillah itself. In Yerushalmi Zokter, in the Yerushalmi it says that actually the request came from Mordechai and Esther together. Mordechai ve Esther kosvu igeres v'sholchu l'Rabbiseinu. They wrote a letter and sent it to our teachers. Shekein omru lahem, and this is what they said to them. Do you accept upon yourself these 2 days should be established as a Yom Tov every year? So das heißt, what the Yerushalmi is saying here is, beide, Mordechai ve Esther, both of them, haben geschrieben und gebeten wegen Zikaron Purim b'chulu. They asked that Purim should be remembered as a Yom Tov. Nicht wie in Bavli, wo es wird im Mont nor Esther allein, Sholchalem Esther, kavuni, kesvuni. As it says in the Bavli, it's Esther the one that sent this letter or requested from the Chachamim that establish it for me, write it for my sake. Here in the Yerushalmi, though, it says that it's Mordechai and Esther together that requested this from the Chachamim. Kamen abezogin, so although it seems like an argument here, however, we could say, das is nit aplukte. There's no argument there at all. On the Tzunach and Ametzias. An argument that would be regarding the facts of what happened. Who is the one that requested the Yom Tov should be established? Zwischen Bavli and Yerushalmi, between the two, the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. Tzide Bakosha is gekommen von Esther allein, whether Esther is the one that requested to establish the Yom Tov, or from beide zusammen, or whether both Mordechai and Esther together requested. nor es redt sich wegen besondere Inyanim. The request of Esther and the request of Mordechai is regarding two different details in the Yontiv of Purim. In Bavli, wegen der Takana von Kriyas HaMegillah. In the Bavli, the request of Esther is dealing with establishing the mitzvah of laying the Megillah. Was the far teitcht Rashi up kavuni. So therefore, how does Rashi translate the idea of kavuni that she's asking, establish it? Nitnar le'yantiv, not only is she asking it to be a yantiv, not oich lekriya, but that you should tell and read the story. Weil der ikke bakasha von Esther, kavuni lias li l'shem, her main request when she said kavuni, what was her personal request, is given b'shayches zu kriyas ha-Megillah, that the Megillah should be read. Was wird gerufen al Shema, the Megillah is on her name. Und danach, euch verschreiben die Megillah als eine von die Ksuvim, kasvuni. And then she also requested that not only should it be read, but it should also be one of the Ksuvim. Und die zwei Bakashes sind gekommen von Esther allein. These two requests of the Chachamim that pertain to the actual Megillah, whether the reading of the Megillah or actually having it written, and you must read the Megillah from the Ksav of the Megillah, not Baal Peh. So this was Esther's own request on the Reshtatvus from Mordechai, without Mordechai participating in this request. In Yerushalmi aber redt sich nur wegen dem Etzem Takone von Kevez an Yemei Purim b'chol Shana Yemei Mishta v'Simcha Mishloach Manes Eshleriei Matanas Lavyanim. The Yerushalmi speaks about instituting the very Yom Tov itself, the day of the Yom Tov, which includes all the mitzvahs of the day, the Mishta, the Simcha, the Mishloach Manes, Matanas Lavyanim, the Yom Tov, not the reading of the Megillah. V'pashtus Loshna Yerushalmi Mekablin Shnei Yomim Alalu B'chol Shana Cholu, to establish these days as special days with the special mitzvahs of the days. Und das, and this request, haben beide zusammengebeten by the Chachamim. Both Mordechai and Esther together sent a letter requesting of the Chachamim that it should be established as a Yom Tov. And as Rashi mentions before also regarding Kavuni, Rashi there mentions the Yom Tov, because Esther did participate with Mordechai to request that it should be established as a Yom Tov. So these are two different things. The Bavli is talking about the takana of reading and writing the Megillah, and that Esther alone requested. And the Yerushalmi is talking about Yom Tov, the day of Purim being established as a Yom Tov for all generations, and that's something that both Mordechai and Esther requested together. The Drei and Yonah Manal, these three details here. Aleph, Mekabla Matam Aleichem Shnei Yom Malalu, to establish these days as a Yom Tov, and Beis Kavuni, that it should be established to read the Megillah, and Gimel Kasvuni, should be established that the Megillah has to be written and be one of the Ksuvim. On that Eiben gesagte Chelek zwischen sei, the difference between them. Der erste Inyan had gebeten Mordechai Esther. Regarding the Yom Tov, this was both Mordechai and Esther's request. Und the letzte zwei, Esther allein. And then regarding the Megillah, reading it and writing it, that was Esther's request alone. Yeshloimar azei zene merumes ba'ad Goshe in der Megillah. This is hinted very clearly in the Megillah when you see there in the Perek Tes of the Megillah, and it talks about the letters that were sent to Yidden or sent to the Chachamim to establish it as a Yom Tov. So we see over there that there's two different details mentioned there regarding establishing Purim as a Yom Tov for future generations. When the Megillah tells how Yidden accepted upon themselves to establish the days of Purim as a Yom Tov. So Zok the Pasuk. So first the Pasuk says, Kashikiyam aleim Mordechai ha-Yehudi ve-Esther ha-Malka, as both Mordechai and Esther have established this. The Nocha besteht, but then at the end of Perek Tes it says, Umaimer Esther kiyam, and what Esther said is fulfilled, Divrei ha-Purim ha'ela, the words, the story of Purim, v'nichtav ba-Sefer, and it's written in the Sefer, in the Megillah. So Yeshleimar, as the zwei psukim reden wegen die drei Yonah Manal. These two psukim here are speaking about the 3 points that we see in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. In der ersten Pasuk redet sich wegen der Takana von Yemei Purim als Tag von Mishta v'Simcha Geimer. When it says the Yemei Purim that Yidden accepted upon themselves, that's the Mishta v'Simcha, all the mitzvahs of the day, celebrating it as a Yom Tov. Wie is mashma von Loshen lekayim es Yemei Purim eila, to establish them to fulfill these days, the mitzvahs as a Yom Tov. Al derech Loshen anal from Yerushalmi, mekablim shnei yomim alalu. Like the Yerushalmi, the same expression the Yerushalmi uses, the request of Mordechai and Esther to establish these 2 days as special days. Und der Fahr wird der Mond beide, Mordechai Yehudi, Esther Amalke, weil die Takone ist gekommen durch sehr beschützwistige Bakasche Kanal. As we said before, both Mordechai and Esther together requested that Purim should be established as a Yom Tov. Da kegen in zweiten Posik, on the other hand though, in the last Posik here in Perik Tes, redt sich wegen der Takone von Kriyas HaMegillah. Here it's speaking about the fact that there's a Takone to read the Megillah on Purim. Und wegen Ksivas HaMegillah, and about the fact that the Megillah is written. Maimer Esther Kiyam Divrei HaPurim Eila. So when it says that Esther's request is fulfilled in the Divrei HaPurim, in the story, in the words of Purim, what is this referring to? Meint the Takana from Kriyas HaMegillah. This refers to telling the story, reading the Megillah. Und der Fahr steht da Divrei Purim, nit Yemei. Therefore it says Divrei, the words, the story of Purim, and it does not say Yemei. Was meint Beremez al Kapanim, die Reid zu reden und erzählen wegen Nes Purim lekriya. This refers to telling and saying the story of Purim, which is what Esther requested, as Rashi says, lekriya, that it should be read. And then the pasuk concludes with Nichtov Basefer, that it's written down in the Sefer. Meint das, was der Sippo von Purim, the Megillah, is verschrieben geworden als eine von die Ksuvim Kasvuni. This was referring to the fact that it's been written in one of the Ksuvim Basefer, which was the other request of Esther. The Far sagt er by the pasuk Maimer Esther und es wird dann der Mann Mordechai. This was Esther's request. Weil die zwei Inyanim hat Esther allein gebeten. These two details regarding the Megillah, the reading of the Megillah and the writing of the Megillah Basefer, this was specifically Esther's request. So we have it very clearly over here. B'negei to establishing the Yom Tov of Purim, Mordechai plays his part in requesting, together with Esther, to establish the Yom Tov as a day, as a Purim. The Purim, that is, should be established as a Yom Tov. And then you have the specific request of Esther to read the Megillah and to write the Megillah. The question is, medarfa befashtein, wie kommt es, Aleph, wie kommt es as Mordechai hat gebeten bei der Chachamim, nor wegen der Takana von Yemei Purim? Why is it that Mordechai only asked of the Chachamim to establish it as a Yom Tov, the days of Purim, und nicht wegen Kriyas und Ksivas HaMegillah? Regarding writing the Megillah, reading the Megillah, that Mordechai did not request at all. Why is this something that's separated from the Yom Tov that's established for Purim, and the writing and the reading the Megillah, which Mordechai did not request that at all? What's the difference? Beis, Nachmer, the question is even stronger. Mordechai is doch gewen a Chave Sanhedrin. Mordechai was a member in the Sanhedrin. Und b'meile is gewen von die Chachamim was haben Masken gewen zu die Bakashes von Esther, Kavuni and Kasvuni. So he was from those Chachamim that agreed to her request to establish it by reading and writing the Megillah. Hat doch Chavade sich gedarft euch mishtatev sein in der Bakashe zusammen mit Esther. If we see that he himself agreed to this, so why didn't he in the beginning include himself together with Esther and participate in this request, just like he did regarding the Yom Tov in general? So darf man sagen, what we have to say is, as bei Mordechai Gufe, zenen in dem gewen zwei Fanem. There are two different aspects of how Mordechai approaches this. Aleph, wie Mordechai is mitzad atzmai. Mordechai himself, as an individual, darf nicht sein der Inyan von Kavuni and Kasvuni. From his perspective, Purim should be celebrated, but without telling the story and without writing the Megillah. Und der Fahr hat sich nicht mishtatev gewen in Bakashas Esther. Therefore, he did not join Esther in her request to read the Megillah and write the Megillah. But Beis, wie is a Chave Sanhedrin, being a member of the Sanhedrin, was das git an Ort zum Memale sein Bakashas Esther, Karvuni and Kasvuni. Here, when the request of Esther comes, as a member of Sanhedrin, he does agree to her request that you should say the story and write the story of the Megillah on Purim. So these are two different aspects of Mordechai that we need to understand what this means. Gimel, the third point there is, Yed der Inyan in Teire is bediuk. Everything in Teire is precise. So darf man sagen, als das, was die Bakashas von Esther, Kavuni Ledeiris und Kasvuni Ledeiris, werden gebracht nor in Bavli, nicht in Yerushalmi. Esther's request about reading and writing the Megillah are mentioned only in Bavli, not in Yerushalmi. Und leerdach, die Bakasha von Mordechai und Esther, mekable matam aleichem shnei yamim alolu, gefindt sich nor in Yerushalmi und nicht in Bavli. The request regarding the Yom Tov in general that both Mordechai and Esther asked together is mentioned in the Yerushalmi. Is this alts b'diuk? The fact that it's divided this way is precise. I mean, you look at these two parts of the Yom Tov, it seems these two things comprise the way we celebrate the Yom Tov of Purim. the reading the Megillah, the writing the Megillah, and the other things, the way we celebrate the Yontiv of Purim, it's really all part of one Yontiv of Purim. So why is it that the Bavli only talks about one aspect and the Yerushalmi talks about a different aspect? This has to be very precise, and there's a reason why each one focuses on a different element of the Yontiv. That das verstehen behagtem, we'll understand this by first explaining as das was die Megillah is verschrieben geworden kesvuni. The fact that the Megillah is written and it becomes one of the ksuvim is nit not an inyan uprat neisef in Nes Purim. It's not just one detail about how the Nes is being recorded. Nor es ist verbunden mit dem etzem teichen Nes. This is connected to the very content of the Nes itself. This is verstandig von dem, was the Gemara sagt in Yuma. This is understood from what the Gemara says. Why is Esther compared to the dawn? It's to tell you, ma shachar, soif kol halayla, just as the dawn is at the end of the night, af Esther soif kol hanisim. Esther is the end of all miracles in history. And the Gemara is masber, so the Gemara there explains, as afal pi the ikke Chanukah, although after the Nes of Purim, there's the Nes of Chanukah, which was also established as a Yontiv in the later time period, was the Nes Chanukah is geschehen noch Nes Purim. Werd aber Esther verrechnet als soif kol hanisim, weil Esther nit no lichtov. Esther, since this is the last Nes that is written in the Ksuvim, so she is the end, the last of the miracles that was written. The letzte Nes was das verschrieben geworden in Torah Shebiksav, Tanakh is Esther. So that's the unique thing about the Nes of Esther. So we see the Gemara refers to this as Soif Kol Hanisim, the fact that it's being written. So das heißt, die Nisim, was nit nur Lichtov, sind aber besondere Suge Nisim. Those Nisim that are recorded and written in one of the Ksuvim is considered to be a category for itself. It's called the end of all Nisim. Und Esther is the Soif von dem Sug. She is the conclusion and the last of the miracles in this category. Und dafke de Far, was Esther nit ne Lichtov, kämen ihr vergleichen le Shachar, soif kol halayla. And this is the reason why we compare it to the dawn, to the end of night, as Esther hat demselben Teuchen wie Shachar. Esther, because of this, is compared to Shachar, to the dawn, as the Rabbi will explain later in the Sikha. Wenn sie wollt nit gewen verschrieben, if the story of Esther was not written in the Ksuvim, wollt man nit gekent machen dem Vergleich. We would never compare Esther to Shachar. She would be already after that time period. So we see that there's something unique about the fact that Esther, that the story of Purim is written in a Megillah and it has to be read dafka from a Megillah that's written as one of the Ksuvim. What is so significant about this? The fact that it's being written on a parchment with ink, how does that make the miracle any different than any of the other miracles that followed in later generations that are not written on a sefer? So the explanation for all of this is as follows. And here the Rebbe will explain the role that Mordechai and Esther both played in the Nes of Purim at the time of the Gzeira, what they each did to bring about the miracle. The Chiluk bepashtos zwischen Mordechai and Esther in Zeir Oiftan and the Mevatel sein Gzeiris Haman. What did they do in order to bring about, to annul the decree of Haman? Mordechai hat sich beiker vernommen mit Moeire sein Jiden Tshuva zu tun. Auf die Averis was haben defiert zu Gzeiris Haman. Mordechai's main involvement was to deal with Yidden, to awaken the Yidden to do Tshuva for the Averis that brought about the Gzeira. Euch der Kneis des Kol HaYehudim v'tzumo, gathering all the Yidden and they fasted. Chotch as Esther hat es gebeten ton. Esther, before she went, Achashverosh, and so she requested of Mordechai to do this. Is aber Mordechai given there, was hat es durchgeführt bepeil? Who's the one that gathers Yidden? Who's the one that brings them to Tshuva? That's Mordechai. So Mordechai's main occupation is with Yidden, to be ma'oire them to Tshuva. Kegen Esther, on the other hand, Esther, was sie is given by Beis HaMelech, she lived by the king of Achashverosh. Nit zwischen Yidden, not amongst Yidden. Und leis kazois higat la malchos, which means lo higat la malchos, ela ba'avura eis azois sheteshi yes Yisrael. The only reason you're here as a queen is for this moment, for this opportunity to come and bring salvation to Yidden. Hat sich mishtadel gewähnt und getan, kame Pulis b'derech hateva as Achashverosh und mevatel sein Gzeiris Haman. What was she doing? She made all the effort and she went and did everything in natural means to see to it that Achashverosh should annul the decree. Sie ist gekommen zu Achashverosh und nicht gerufene Heit. She went to Achashverosh uninvited. Hat zugegerät is Sudas for Achashverosh und Haman v'cholo. She prepared the festive meals for them and so on. So her main occupation in bringing about the miracle was a natural means and to get with Achashverosh and Haman. And andere Werte. So the difference between the role that Mordechai and Esther play in being mevatel the Gzeira is as follows. Mordechai had getan be'iker in dem ruchni is the Chelek from bittel Gzeira. Mordechai's main focus was to do what is necessary in the spiritual sense, that the tshuva and so on, to be mevatel the Gzeira, which means oiftan dem bittel Gzeira l'mayla, to bring about to know the source of the decree, which came from above in Beruchnius. Is the Rebbe seines Astes given mit und zwischen Yidden. So his main occupation was to deal with Yidden and to bring Yidden to do tshuva, to remove the Gzeira, the source of the Gzeira l'mayla. Esther, on the other hand, Esther had getan be'ikir in der Stadlos and Darkei Teva. Her main point was to deal and do what has to be done here in nature. Durch welche der Bittel Gzeira l'mayla is durchgeführt geworden l'mata. So to bring down the bittel of the Gzeira from above, to bring it down, to be manifest here below, so she had to do her hishtadlos and teva. Sie hat alles getan durch Achashverosh. Whatever she did was through Achashverosh. Bis as Achashverosh hat mevatel gewend the Gzeira, and she brought Achashverosh himself to annul the decree. And it was transformed, and whatever they wanted to do to the Yidden was done to them, to the haters of the Jews. This is the two roles that Mordechai and Esther play in being mevatel the Gzeira of Haman. So based on this we could say, in demselben Neufen, wie Mordechai and Esther haben sich voneinander geteilt, benegei sehr Paulus zum mevatel sein the Gzeira, just as we see very clearly here, the difference between Mordechai and Esther, what each did in order to annul the decree, there's also a difference between them. What is the main emphasis in the actual miracle of Purim? What's the main accomplishment and the main emphasis in the miracle? By Mordechai is that Goshe ben Es Purim, der Ruchni is the Genetzachen von Yidden. By Mordechai, his main effort to be mevatel the Gzeira was the Ruchni is the Getshuva of Yidden. So by him, the main accomplishment of the miracle is the spiritual victory. Das, was sie haben Tshuva getan, und in Azar Eufen bis es hat aufgetan, der Kimu, Mashe Kiblu Kvar. The fact that Yidden did Tshuva, they accepted the Torah from new, the Torah that the Yidden had already. Their Hadar Kiblua b'meach Hashverish. The fact that now in the time of this Gzeira, they accepted the Torah again. Hat abgenommen die Meidal, Rabbi, Reisu from Matan Torah. And this removed the big question that there was on the Yidden's acceptance of Torah at the time of Matan Torah, because then it was Kofa Aleim Har Kegigis. Yidden were forced to accept the Torah, so to speak. Und der Far hat Mordechai gewollt. So since this is the main emphasis by Mordechai, he sees this as like a new Matan Torah, as a new Ruchni is the acceptance of the Torah. That's the main accomplishment of the miracle. So therefore, how did Mordechai request that Purim should be celebrated? Had Mordechai gewollt, as Purim soll sein Oster b'melacha. Purim should be a day that you don't do any work, like any Yom Tov. Val derech Yom HaKippurim, and Purim should be similar to Yom Kippur, Yom HaTshuva, a day of Tshuva, or the Nesinas Luchas Shniyos, and similar to Yom Kippur, which was also renewing Matan Torah again and giving Yidden the second Luchas. Es soll sein a Tag, auf zu abgeben sich mit den Yonei HaNefesh. Purim should be a day to be separated from any mundane activity and to focus on soul, on the soul, on Ruchnius, because it's another Matan Torah. Just like we see regarding Mordechai, that his role in the Gzeira, in the time of the Gzeira, was to be Ma'eder Yidden L'Tshuva, to bring them to elevate themselves, to be able to be Zeicha to the miracle. So when the miracle happens, the main Nitzochen that Mordechai sees is the Ruchni, is the accomplishment. Ashenken Esther hat Marduk gewen in dem Nest, die hat Zolle von Gzeiras Haman, Lahashmed, Lare, Gelabe, das Kol HaYehudim Geimer. By Esther, her main focus at the time of the Gzeira was the Teva, the Gashmi, the things necessary to do. So when the Hatzalah comes about, so by her the main focus is the fact that the Yidden were saved physically from being wiped out. The Hatzalas HaGufim from Yidden. The fact that they physically, their lives were saved. Obelashna Levush, the Levush that explains the difference between Chanukah and Purim. So he says, Shahisa Gzeira lahashmid uvelareg es hagufais. On Purim, the main Gzeira was to literally wipe out the existence of Klal Yisrael physically. V'loyas hanefashos, not the souls, not the religion. Lekach geshenitzlu mimenu chulu. So when they were saved, the main salvation was regarding the Gashmis of the Yidden. So from Esther's viewpoint, this is the main focus of the miracle of Purim, the Gashmis of the Yidden which is saved. So we see here the difference between Mordechai and Esther as far as the role they both played in the Gzeira, And also, as far as the miracle is concerned, the miracle of Purim is a twofold miracle. A ruchniistige one and a gashmiistige one. Mordechai sees and focuses primarily on the ruchniistige nitzachen, and Esther focuses primarily on the gashmiistige nitzachen, the fact that the physical gufim of the Yidden were saved when Achashverosh transformed the Gezerah. So this takes us to the next step, the difference between Mordechai and Esther as far as how we celebrate Purim itself every year. By remembering the miracle every year on Purim is the bakoshe from the Kabbalah Matam Aleichem Shnei Yomim Alolu. So when it came to the request to establish it as a yontiv, gekommen from Mordechai and Esther. So both Mordechai and Esther requested this. Und die bakoshe is kavuni and kasvuni nor von Esther allein. Who is the one that requests that the Megillah should be read and the Megillah should be written? That only comes from Esther. Weil die drei Yonim dricken sich aus, there is a kanon von Nes Purim auf verschiedene Eifanim. We see here the different aspects, primarily the two aspects of what the Nes of Purim was, and each Mordechai and Esther sees it from their viewpoint, what's the main focus of the Nes. By Mekayim Zayin Yemei Purim. So if you look at just celebrating Purim, which Mordechai and Esther both requested, so how do you celebrate Purim? Chachas das ist verbunden mit die Mitzvahs Maisies von Mishte, Simcha, Mishleich Manes, Matanas Lav Yainim. So you celebrate Purim with the various different mitzvahs, which are actions, by eating, drinking, and the Mishleich Manes and Matanas Lav Yainim. So these things are actions. However, is in Yonam Bepashtus, what's the point of all of these actions? Do you have the actual Teichen, remembrance of Purim in the very actions themselves? No, but what's the point here? As durch sei sollen Yidden b'machshavtom b'nafsham kommen zum Zikaron Hanes. So as far as actually remembering and mentioning the miracle itself on Purim, in these mitzvahs, you don't have any memory of the actual miracle. The story of the miracle is not being said in any of these mitzvahs. It's through fulfilling all these mitzvahs, so they have a content that will connect and remind you to think about what they are coming to commemorate, and you in your mind will come and remember the Nes of Purim. So as far as celebrating Purim, through what Mordechai and Esther requested together, primarily Mordechai, which is to celebrate the day of Purim with all of the mitzvahs, the point over here is that it's going to be a ruchniisdige yomtiv, that Yidden are going to do all kinds of things to remind them to get into the mode and into the spirit to remember beruchniis, b'machshava, what the specialty of the day is, and to celebrate and thank the Eibishter for the Nes of Purim. So that's primarily remembering it b'machshava. However, the request of kavuni, which is likriya, that you have to actually tell the story, you're not just relying on doing certain things that are connected to the teichen of the day to remind you, to bring your memory, to relive and re-experience it, but to actually tell the story, kommt es a karon hanes arop in dibur. So here you're actually saying it, you're verbalizing and saying the story. When you say it and you speak it with your mouth, the movement of your lips is an action that you're saying the story. And even more so, aber von deswegen is dibur blois a meise zutta. Saying the story with your mouth and the movement of your lips is an action, and you're not just reminding yourself and getting into the spirit of the yontif, but you're also actually saying it with your mouth. But that's only considered to be a small action. Noch durch bakoshes kesvuni wird der Zikaron Hanes herabgetragen in Meiser Rabba. When you write the miracle, ink on parchment, this is a Meiser Rabba, this is an action of writing the actual story. Der Nes wird verschrieben b'dyoy gashmi auf klaf gashmi v'chulu. It's the physical ink on the physical parchment that you write the story, you bring it down into the physical element of the world. So this is the difference between Mordechai and Esther as far as their request and how to establish the Yom Tov of Purim. By Mordechai was the Adgoshes Haneses by Yom Nitzachon Ruchni. As we said before, Mordechai, the main emphasis of the miracle was the spiritual victory. Ruchni is from mention. So for him, the main celebration of how we're going to remember the miracle of Purim is by doing all kinds of things that will get us into the spirit, get our minds into the mode of thinking about and thanking the Eibishter for the miracle of the day. But not that it has to come out in your mouth in words or on physical parchment. Even more so, Mordechai's desire was that Purim should be a spiritual day, similar to Yom Kippur, a day there's no work done on this day. That's Mordechai's approach to how Purim should be celebrated from his viewpoint. Dagegen by Esther was the Adgoshes Anes is the Chelek Pshuta. From Esther's viewpoint, the main ness was the fact that Yidden were literally saved, their lives were saved. That Solas Hagufa Gashmi. Is the Rebbe nit genug as the Zikaron Anes lo seine Machshava. It's not enough that the remembrance of the miracle should be remembering it and thinking it over and reliving it in your mind, nor darf be'iker arabkommen in Asiya. In Meise Zute und danach in Meise Rabbe. Her request was Kivuni and Kizvuni, that the Megillah should be read and you should verbally say the story and you should write the story on parchment and ink in order to bring down and express the other element of the miracle, or from her viewpoint, the main element of the miracle, which is the fact that the physical bodies of the Yidden were saved at the time of this the miracle. So this is the difference we see here in each stage, both at the time of the Gzeira, and as far as the miracle, and as far as how we establish Purim for all generations, the difference between Mordechai and Esther's approach. Das was Mordechai hat nur gebeten mekabel matem alechem shnei yamim alolu. So the fact that Mordechai's request was only to establish it as a yomtiv, nit kavuni und kizvuni, and he did not request like Esther that the story should be said verbally and that it should be written. Is das wie Mordechai is mitzad matzav u'mailas atzmai. This is Mordechai as an individual himself, the level that he's on, who he is. So he does not see this aspect of Purim as being the main thing. Was dan zet euch sein dar. So Mordechai, being the leader of his generation, so what's his perspective? What does he see as the main emphasis and the main victory? Was is parnes v'roish v'zestehen v'yonkis v'chayis from him. The whole generation, which he's their leader, and they get their chayis from him, like every rebbe of every generation. V'zezenen mitzad nishmasam v'ruchniyusam. So the main thing that he sees is the neshama of the Yidden, the ruchnius of the Yidden, the tshuva, and the nitzachon, as far as it being like a new matan Torah, a new acceptance of the Torah, which is the neshama and the ruchnius of the Purim. Und mitzad zeh ruchnius is genug as the zikaron anes lo zayin b'machshava. So therefore, in his viewpoint, it's enough that the remembrance of the nes should be in your thoughts. It's not so significant that it should be remembered and come down in action to write the Megillah on a parchment, as we explained before. But so this is who Mordechai himself is, and as a leader of his generation, this is the aspect of Purim that he sees as the main miracle. However, when Mordechai sits as a member in the Sanhedrin, and everything, all questions, all difficulties are brought to the Sanhedrin to handle, to answer, and to explain. Und Inyan HaSanhedrin is zu pasken in dem Din Lamaisa. Sanhedrin is there to pay attention to practical life of the Yidden, to see how to handle things. Was zu lieb dem darfen sie sich herablassen zu Yidden, und sehen sie matze v'noilam agashmi mitzad gufam. And here a Sanhedrin has to come down and see the physical, material situation and the bodies and the people to know exactly how to pasken a halacha on a practical level. Und the psak halacha darf durchgeführt werden in Meise. The actual psak has to be fulfilled in action. So here, not Mordechai as the Rebbe of the generation, but as one of the Sanhedrin that's paskening halachas for all the Yidden, dan zeta Yidden mitzad gufam. From this viewpoint, he also sees the existence of who Yidden are and the miracle mitzad their physical existence, mitzad their bodies. Was mitzad them darf the zikaron anas harabkommen in Meise mamish. And because of this, the remembrance and the celebration of the Nes Purim, even Mordechai agreed, like Esther's request, that it should be celebrated physically by verbalizing it and bringing it down in Maisa and writing it. Val daf gedas, the nemt der guf betachlis. When it's said verbally and when it's written on a piece of paper, this is the way to celebrate the miracle, that it should even affect your body, that even the guf of the person should be involved in celebrating the Nes. So therefore the point here is that there's the Mordechai as on his own, his viewpoint and his participation in the miracle and the way he sees his generation. And then there's Mordechai as one of the Sanhedrin, and therefore here he agrees to Esther and he sees Yidden as they are in the world of practical and in the guf of the Yidden, the way the Purim should be celebrated in Olam Haza Agashmi, in the guf. This is the explanation, the Pashtos and Alpinigla, and the role that Mordechai and Esther played, Benegea, to what Purim is, both in the time of the Gzeira, and what the main point of the miracle is, and as far as how we establish it as a Yom Tov. That Inyan Anal and Signif and Teres Achsidis, they explain what we said until here in the words of the way Chassidus sees it. The chiluk zwischen Madreges Mordechai und Madreges Esther. What's the difference between the levels of Mordechai and Esther? Mordechai is in Yonai Yisoid Abba. It says in Kabbalah, Mordechai's level is Yisoid Abba, which is Chachma. Was mitzad Abba, Sfiris HaChachma, is Nigeya dem Inyan Oir. What is Chachma? Chachma is Oir, godly revelation. Chachma is the beginning of all Sfiris, and Chachma draws a revelation into the Sfiris. As the Rabbi brings in the Ha'ara, that it says in Kabbalah, it says in Chassidus, that in Oir, even the Keli of Oir, of Chachma that is also Oir. Oir is that like when a person is learning something. Chachma that is. What's Chachma? When a person is learning something and he has a difficulty. What's the Chachma? That flash of understanding, that opening, that revelation that he sees a clarity in what he's learning. Even if he can't apply it and explain it in the details, but there's a light. There's an opening that he understands. So that's why Chachma represents Oir, a Lichtigkeit, a godly revelation. That's Mordechai. Esther is Sfiras HaMalchus. Esther represents Malchus, the end of all the Sfiras. Und in dem Gufe, wie Malchus is Yeredes and Olam is Biyah. It refers to Malchus not as it exists in the world of Atzilus, in the end of all the Sfiras, starting with Chachma and completing with Malchus and Atzilus, but it's Malchus as it becomes that link to draw down the revelation into the lower worlds, into Biyah. This is Merumis in your Namen. Esther von Loshen, Va'anoichi Haster Aster, Tachlis Ahelem Va'Hester, referring to Malchus, which is a place of concealment. Not only the concealment in the world of Atzilus, if it's still part of the world of Atzilus, it's not really a place of concealment, but it's the sphere of Malchus as a source to Biyah, not only as a source to Biyah, but actually coming down, the Ashpa, in the worlds of Biyah, where there's a Hester, a double Hester. Was mitzad Sfiras HaMalchus is Nigeya der Inyan HaKelim. In the sphere of Malchus, it's the exact opposite of Chachma, where the main emphasis is Oir. In Malchus, the main emphasis is the Kelim, to be a receiver, a recipient. That's what Malchus is about, as the Rabbi brings in the Ha'ara, that Malchus lesla megar ma klum. It's just there to receive the revelations that are there from before. And the whole idea of Kelim is to contain, to define, to limit, and so on, which as we'll see is the source of what nature is, the laws of nature that define everything in their place and in their existence. So that's what Kelim are all about. The exact opposite of Oir. The Oir is Bligvul, the unlimited godly revelation. And Kelim is Gvul, is to define and bring everything down in a very particular and defined and tailored way. Der Chelek zwischen dem Eufen wie Nes Purim wird Herd, mitzad dem Minyan Oir. Und wer is nirgash mitzad HaKelim. So now we can understand much deeper the point that we said before in the two viewpoints and what's the emphasis on the miracle of Purim, in Mordechai and Esther. So the way the miracle of Purim is interpreted and understood and sensed from the perspective of Oir and the perspective of Kelim is very different. And here the Rebbe points out what's unique about the Nes of Purim. The Nes Purim, zayendik von die Nissim hamelubashim beteva. So the Nes of Purim was enclosed in nature. It happened through natural means. Hatten sich zwei Ktzaves. So we see there's two opposite things about this Nes of Purim that came through natural means. As you look at the story of Purim, you don't see anything that broke nature. Everything happened in natural means. Von ein Seite, on one hand, wie bald as der Nes is angetan in Teva. Und in Aneufen, Shalehoya, Dovan, Nirela, Ein, Shula, Maila, Teva. It was all within nature, and there was nothing that you could point at, that you saw clearly that had to break nature. Is move on, as that is verbunden mit dem Eure Leki, was kommt darab, is Lapshus in Welt. So the Nes of Purim, the source of this Nes comes from a revelation of godliness that's related to Welt, that's related to Teva, and is within Teva, and affects nature internally, through nature itself, not to break nature. That's the level of the Nes of Purim. That's on one hand. Von dem zweiten Seite, but there's another side to this. There's another perspective to the Nes of Purim. Wie bald, das ist ein Inyan von Nes. It was a miracle. Yes, it came through Teva, but it was a miracle. Vigilei Elokus. Every miracle is a revelation of godliness above the usual measure of godliness that's invested in nature itself. And biz nire b'chosh shekol hasibis hoyurak l'mayla ma'teva. Although it didn't break nature, but if you pay attention to the way things were set up and how things were orchestrated and happened in the story of Purim, you can clearly see that there is a Nes above nature that's guiding all the events within nature. Is move on, as the Sheirish from dem Nes is from dem Eure Leki, was is Heche from Teva. So this is a Nes, and therefore the source of these events comes from a level of godliness which is above nature, above the regular measure of godliness within nature. Und nachmer, even more so, even the fact that it's within nature indicates even further how high the source of this nes is. Das Gufe, was the nes can herabkommen in Teva, the fact that it comes into nature. So from this perspective, is a bavais as b'shar shoy, is a heche von den nissen gluyim. That actually means that it has an even deeper and higher source than those revealed miracles that have to shatter nature in order for the miracle to be performed. Was der Rebbe is nit mugbal in the Agbala von Heche von Teva und wird nimshach in Teva Gufe. When you have a miracle that breaks nature, so what that means is that nature presents a blockage to this revelation. And the only way this revelation could be implemented is by breaking nature. When you have a miracle that comes from an even higher source, that's even more unlimited, this infinite revelation goes straight into nature. It penetrates nature, and the nature does not present any blockage to this revelation. So the fact that a nes is coming into Teva, from this viewpoint, this actually shows that this is coming from an even higher place. So we have two different angles over here of looking at the very nature of the nes of Purim itself. On one hand, it's a nes that's integrated in nature. It allows nature to exist. It's related to nature. On the other hand, though, there's the bligvul of the nes. There's the revelation that's unlimited, that comes from a place that's removed from Teva. And adarabah, the fact that it comes into Teva expresses even more so how much Teva in no way presents any blockage to this unlimited revelation. Two different approaches here to what this is. Und das ist der Chelek zwischen dem Nes Purim, wie ist mitzad Eir, und wie ist mitzad Kelim. So these two perspectives about the Nes of Purim is the difference if you look at a Nes, this Nes of Purim, from the angle of Eir, of revelation, the source of where it comes from, und wie ist mitzad Kelim. And then looking at the miracle, at how it's contained and how it comes down within nature. That in Eir, tutoiv dem gilui v'nes. As far as the Oyer is concerned, what's the perspective of Oyer? The source, the revelation. What is this? Nes of Purim is a revelation of a bleak vul from an unlimited source. The Nes v'yeriz mitzat sharshoyim mekayre. The Nes from its source is a revelation of an unlimited godly revelation in the world, and therefore it completely does not pay attention to nature. And even the fact that it comes into nature shows even more so how much nature is not teifes makim, and therefore nature doesn't present any blockage. It's able to enter into nature itself. That's from the perspective of Oyer. The Oyer penetrates everything. The Inyan from the Kelim, then there's a completely different angle and perspective on what the Nes is. Looking at it from the perspective of Kelim is zu herabtragen dem Nes in Helen v'hester von v'levushei Teva. The fact that the Nes enters into Teva, what is that an indication of? That this is a Nes that's actually being integrated in the Teva itself. The point of the Nes is to affect the Teva. Not that it's a bleak vul that doesn't know of Teva, doesn't care about Teva, and therefore it could operate even through Teva because it's so powerful that Teva doesn't present any blockage to it. No. From the perspective of Kelim, which is to contain and define and bring down Gili Elikos in a place of Teva, so when a Nes comes into Teva, what this represents is the fact that Teva itself is becoming elevated. Teva itself is becoming changed. Was in dem führt sich aus der Mechuvin von Nes. This accomplishes the whole purpose of the miracle, which is to ibemachen dem Helm von Teva, to transform the concealment of Teva itself. That's the mile of a Nes which is melubish in Teva. As man soll sehen, wie Teva wird geführt von Eibishter allein, to come to recognize what the true existence of nature itself is. That nature itself is all the Eibishter himself in nature. So we have two completely different outlooks at what the accomplishment of Purim being a Nes HaMelubish b'Teva is. From the perspective of Oyer, that just expresses even more how powerful this Oyer is. That it's so powerful that Teva is completely not Tevis Makim. Or Memele, it doesn't even have to break Teva. It could just go straight into Teva. So it's not that it elevates Teva. Adarabah, from the perspective of Oyer, the fact that it comes into Teva shows more how bleak vul the Oyer is. Then you have the perspective of Kelim, which is Adarabah, that the whole accomplishment of a Nes coming into Teva is that it's Megala what the true Mitzias of Teva is. That because it's being Mislabish in Teva, this reveals that Teva itself is really Elikos. And that's the purpose of a Nes. Not just to reveal the Bligvul of the Eibishter, but to reveal how Teva itself is Be'emes B'pnimiyas Elikos. And that's the perspective of Kelim, the perspective of Esther. Und das ist der Chelek zwischen Mordechai and Esther. So this is the difference in the two perspectives of Mordechai and Esther as far as what's the main emphasis of the Ness of Purim. Mitzad Mordechai, Inyan Ha'or. Mordechai represents the godly revelation. Is that Ikerat Goshe for Nes Purim Nitten Zichu Chateva. So the main emphasis of the Nes of Purim is not that it refines and changes nature, nor an Esgalus Ha'or. The fact that this is an indication that it's an even more powerful revelation. Das was der Nes, wird Nesgala, das was durch der Nes, wird Nesgala der Blieg Vol Ha'amiti is Barach. The fact that it can come down and there's nothing blocking it. It can even go into nature, reveals the true Blieg Vol of the Eibishter, that it doesn't have to shatter nature. It can go straight into nature. As is the Grecht bis Lamata Mata. It's a Blieg Vol that goes to the lowest place, in Anagas HaTeva, into Teva itself. That's the perspective of Mordechai. Und der Rebbe is eichen dem Zikaron Nes nit as eine Geas as all upcoming in Maise. So therefore, as we explained before, as far as remembering and celebrating Purim, it's not so important that it should be celebrated and come down into an action. Es is genug, was der Zikaron Nes direkt zu heißen, die Mitzvahs Maisis from Purim. Yes, we remember the Nes through celebrating Purim with the mitzvahs that we do, aber der Zikaron Nes Gufe can bleiben b'machshave v'ruchnis. Actually telling the story is something that in the perspective of Mordechai is not necessary. That's enough in machshava that a person will get into the spirit and in the mode of Purim through the mitzvahs, and then in your mind you'll relive and celebrate Purim in machshava beruchnius. Undefar ver derinyen gebracht in Yerushalmi. This explains why this aspect of Purim, which Mordechai requested to celebrate Purim in a more ruchniusige sense, that's mentioned in Yerushalmi. Was in Teire Gufe is this the Inyan Ha'or. Within Teire, there are two aspects of Teire. Yerushalmi is a place where things shine more direct and clear from the source. We gefind gleich die richtige Svare in Teretz v'chulu, as the style is in the learning of Yerushalmi, that Yerushalmi says the point straight as it is without much discussion. V'yene v'zet azach in the lichtigkeit, like someone that sees things in the open and when things are clear directly from the source. That's Yerushalmi. Mitzad Esther, on the other hand, Esther's perspective is Inyan HaKelim. Esther represents the Kelim. Hester Aster is der Ikerat Goshen Nes Purim, das was durch dem wird übergemacht, dem Hester und Choshech von Teva. From her perspective, what's the accomplishment that the Nes comes into Teva? Not an indication that it's a greater bleak vul of the Oyer. No, in her perspective, the Maila is the Mechuvin that it should transform the Choshech itself. It should transform the Teva itself. The far is eichen dem Zikaron Nes Negeya, as is all upcoming in Olam Asiyah. So therefore, in her perspective, what's the main way Purim should be celebrated? It has to come down and be connected and celebrated in action, in a place of action, in Kriya Uksive, to speak it, to write it. Warum dafke durch dem führt sich heist dem Bechuven von dem Nes, as Teva Gufa soll mehr sein. That this is the whole point of the miracle, that to reveal the true nature, the true source of what nature itself is, that nature itself is Elokos, that nature itself begins to shine. And that's by celebrating it, by bringing it down into Maise, into saying it, into verbalizing it, into writing it in a parchment with ink. Und the far wird derinyen gebracht im Bavli. So we can understand why it's this aspect of the miracle that's mentioned specifically in the Bavli. Was b'machashaka moshivani zeh talmudah shel Bavel. The Gemara says that you've been placed in darkness. That refers to the style of learning in the Gemara and Bavli, where it's a discussion and questions and answers. Es is da den inyan from bir achayshech. In the Bavli you have refining and answering questions and elevating the darkness itself in Teire Gufe, in Teire itself. This is the aspect of Kalim and Machashakim in Teire itself. So it's beautifully understood exactly why these two aspects of the Yom Tov are divided between Mordechai and Esther and the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. Alpi kol anal vet man euch verstehen dem Vergleichen von Esther zum Shachar. Why the Gemara in Yuma says that we compare Esther to the dawn. Ma shachar soif kol halayla, just as the dawn is at the end of the night, af Esther soif kol hanissim. So Esther as well is the last of all the nissim. And wie das is verbunden mit dem, was Esther nit nur lichtoif. And as we see in the Gemara, that Esther is the end of all nissim, is the end of all nissim that were written. That's written and becomes part of ksuvim. So what's the connection between being the end of all nissim and the fact that this is a nes that's written in ksuvim? So now, das was the Gemara vergleicht Soif Kol HaLayla. The fact that the Gemara compares the end of the night to Soif Kol HaNissim, to Esther, to the story of Purim being the end of all Nissim, the L'chayres and the Nesun Laila Hofchi and Betachlis. Why is this being used as an analogy? Night and miracle are complete opposites. Wie der Marsha fragt, this is the question of the Marsha. Why does the Gemara use this as an analogy? Is this vile? So the answer is Vigeret Frie Saif Sif Yud. Based on what we said before, this is beautifully understood. Der Tachlis von Anes is as Teva Gufa soll sich ändern. That the truth is, the purpose of every miracle is not just the performance of a miracle that's outlandish, that takes you out of nature. No, the point of every miracle is really to remind you and wake you up to what the true existence of nature itself is. As in Teva, was mitzadatzma is an inyan von Laila v'chayshech, so that you should see in nature itself. Which nature itself is nature, it's darkness, it's night. You should see that the truth of what nature is, it's also godliness. That's really the purpose of all miracles. The Laila itself, you should see the true entity of what Laila is. And therefore the Gemara brings Laila, Saif Kala Laila, as an analogy to Saif Kala Nisim. And Esther is Saif Kala Nisim. Esther, the nest of Purim, represents the end, the purpose of all Nisim. She is the Saif v'tachlis von alle Nisim. So we can translate the word Saif not only as being the last of all the Nisim that was written, but also being the Saif, the purpose and the nest that reaches the goal in its fullest extent. This is the miracle that brings down the revelation of the Eibishter into the lowest place, fulfilling the purpose of a nes, to bring the Eibishter into the concealment of the world. Weil sie peilt nicht nur in dem Chayshach von Olam Hazeh, was hat Shaychis is besmichus ze'or. The miracle that happened at the time of Purim is not a kind of miracle that came into nature, but only into one element of nature, an element of nature that's sort of more spiritual, that's more eisgeedelt, closer to and more of a keli to lichtigkeit. The edel inyan from Olam Hazeh. It would reach only, there are certain miracles that do come to nature, they do penetrate nature to some extent, but they only reach those areas in nature which are refined, which is somewhat of a keli for the miracle. No, that's over here, however, by Purim, Esther, the nest of Purim, brings this down in Soif Kol Halayla. This is a miracle that happens in the deepest darkness of Laila. In Tachlis HaCheshech VaHelem VaHester Aster von Olam Haster Aster von Olam Hazeh VaShotnet Kein Shayches Ze'or. You see a darkness in a world, in a galus, and a gzeira, like the situation the Eden were in then, lahashmed, larig, la'abed, and in there, in the lowest and darkest time period, the Nes comes and actually enters within nature itself. There's no miracle that you see that breaks nature. It comes into nature itself to reveal the true entity of what that darkness and that situation itself is. That it's really lichtig, it's really part of godliness. Just like at the end of the night, as it is literally, was dafke dan fahren aleisa shachar is der cheshach halayla mit meres gabres wie b'meshach der nacht. The darkest time of the night is right before the crack of dawn. At the end of the night, that's the darkest time. So that was the time of the Gzeira of Haman, the darkest time for Klal Yisrael then, and the miracle comes about and happens within nature, within that darkness. That's Soif Kol HaNisim, the purpose of the fulfillment of what a Nes is about, to reveal what Teva and what Cheshach itself truly is. Und al pizes verstandig was dafke di Nisim, was einen in Sug von Nitna Lichtov. So those Nisim that are written, that are recorded in Torah, including over here the Nes of Esther that's recorded in the Torah, kemen vergleichen zu Laila, we compare it to night, ubefrat, and over here regarding the Nes of Purim, zu Soif Kol Laila, the end of all of night. Das was bei Dinissim is der Zikaron HaNes herabgetragen geworden in Ksive V'Asiyah, the fact that these miracles are recorded in Torah and they're recorded on parchment and ink. In Asiyah, was in Olam Hazeh Gufa is a Suga Daimim. That means that you're writing the miracle and you're bringing it down to the lowest element of the world, into Daimim. Saif Kol HaMadreges von Olam Asiyah, into the lowest of levels, even within this world itself. Is this while Di Nissim is in Yonom zu Ibemachen dem Laila. All those Nissim that are mentioned in the Torah, they're recorded in the Torah. What's the point of all these Nisim? The Eibishter does not perform a Nes to only show how unlimited He is, but also to show us and to reveal to us the true existence of what nature itself is. And therefore it has to be recorded and it's expressed in a physical paper or a physical parchment here in this world. And even more so when it comes to Purim, which is the end and the purpose of all these miracles, since it happens in the greatest darkness that there was in that time period. And therefore, Esther is the Soif Kol HaLayla, the end and the fulfillment of this purpose, to write the Nes on a parchment and to be part of Ksuvim. like all the other miracles that are before, and even more so, even Soif Kalalayla, accomplishing this even to a greater degree. That is the connection of Esther to Soif Kalalayla. But the Gemara also says that it's not only that Esther is at Soif Kalalayla, but the Gemara says that Esther is compared to Shachar, to the dawn that comes at the end of the night. Das ist euch der Bior, was nimshula Esther le Shachar. Esther is compared to the dawn. The Eira Shachar, was is Bekeya, dem Choshech von Soif Kalalayla. The light of dawn, the crack of dawn that comes at the end of the night when you have the strongest darkness, and then you have that crack of dawn that breaks that darkness. Weist of dem Eir. So what this really is referring to is, it's a revelation. Was wird nimshach dafke mina choshech shekodmai. This crack of dawn comes from the darkness itself. It's revealing the true entity of the darkness itself, and therefore it comes out from the night itself. It brings you to the dawn. Das was mis mahapech dem choshech gufe le'oir. So Shachar represents not the dawn, the morning that comes following the night, but it's from the night that you lead into the morning, because it's revealing the true entity of the darkness itself that's now shining in the dawn, in the light of the dawn. This is hinted in the actual word for dawn in Lashon Kodesh, Shachar. Was is von Lashon Shachrus v'Kadrus v'Choshech. The word Shachar actually means deep darkness, a very strong and deep darkness. So how could we say that the morning, the word in Lashon Kodesh for morning is Shachar, which means a deep darkness? Because the answer is, this is the depth of what the darkness itself is, transforming the strongest darkness that was there right before the crack of dawn, and that is the breakthrough of dawn to transform and reveal what the darkness itself is, that it's truly light. And that's why Esther is compared to Shachar. On Isaiah in Spheris, the same is also true in the Spheris above. Ayeles HaShachar do Knesset Yisrael. So it says in Zohar that Shachar refers to Knesset Yisrael. Knesset Yisrael is Spheris HaMalchus. Und wie bald das Shachar is Soif Kol HaLayla. So the Gemara says that Shachar is the end of the night, is move on. So what level of Malchus are we talking about? It's understood that das is Spheris HaMalchus, nit wie sie is, b'mekayman Atzilus. We're not talking about Malchus in the world of Atzilus, over there as part of Atzilus, where the unity of Hashem is sensed in everything, including in Malchus, so there's no darkness there. Or that afilu v'ziveret atek lebriya. We're also not even referring to the level of Malchus as it becomes the atik, the pnimius akesa, the source of the light that then is transmitted over to the world of Bria. Wo der inyan of Malchus is begilui, and the koyach of Malchus to bring over the revelation of Atzilus to Bria is still revealed and very powerful there. No, rather, when we talk about the sphere of Malchus here being hinted in the word Shachar, what are we talking about? V'yizi redes and Helem v'Hester v'neilam is biyah. This refers to the level of Malchus that comes down into the lowest darkness, into the worlds of Biyah. The fact that Malchus brings down this revelation into the lower worlds to truly reveal what the true concealment of the world itself is. As we explained before regarding who Esther herself is, and the same is also true with the Sphira Lamaila, which is Malchus, and specifically Malchus and Biyah, which corresponds to Esther here below. Das was Esther macht iber der Helem v'Hester ha'olam. So the fact that Malchus and Esther is able to transform and reveal the true nature of the concealment of the world itself, that it's really godly. Chotch as in Yonah is Haster Aster, although the source of Esther is Malchus and Biyah, which is a place of concealment. Is this nit nor bekoicha shel Mordechai? It's not only with the partnership between Esther and Mordechai that each, as we explained before, plays their role in the miracle. And Mordechai brings, Vasinyani is Oyer Vigiloi Kanal Barucha. Mordechai introduces revelation, the Ness aspect, the believable aspect into the miracle. So the way Esther could reveal the truth of what Teva itself is not only because of the koyach of Mordechai that reveals what nature is really about. Esther Gufa is b'pnimiyusa hechel legamri fundem Hester. It's because it's the Hester itself. Esther, which represents the concealment of Elam Hazeh, the true pnimius of what this Hester itself is really actually even higher than Mordechai. It's completely higher than the Hester that we can see, that it seems what it is. When you reveal the true nature of what nature is, of what Teva is, this reveals an even higher connection, a higher level that Esther really is. This is the Pirish HaPnimi and Pasik. This is the deeper meaning of what the Pasik says when it speaks about the two names that Esther had. Hadassah, he Esther. Hadassah, she is also Esther. What's the significance of these two names? What this means is, Oich in der Yeride in Helen v'Hester ha'olam Esther. Even that aspect of Esther, which represents the concealment and all the descent and darkness that there is, that exists in this world, is faran de bechinas Hadassah. Bepnimius, the Hadassah, the other name of Esther, that is the Pnimius of Esther. Hadassah, he Esther, which Elo at Tzadikim. Hadassah refers, like the Hadas, which refers to Tzadikim. Was weiß der Pnimius am Malchus, was is miyuchad mit isfiris shalamayla mimena. The Pnimius of what Malchus is about is the same revelation as all the spheres above it, and even more so. Malchus is really drawing from the spheres above and then transmitting and bringing down that Gilui into the next world, into Bria, Yitzira, Asiya, into the lowest place. The purpose of Malchus, when you look at it b'chitzonius, it seems to be to conceal, to limit, and to cover. But b'pnimius, the point of Malchus is adarabah, to transmit the light, to bring over the energy and the Gilui Elokus even into a lower place. So Malchus has an even higher shadish that it's able to reveal the true nature of Teva itself. And that's Hadassah, he Esther. You look at Esther, you have to know that b'pnimius, this is Hadassah. B'pnimius, Malchus is really miyuchad with all the spheres above. So this is the powerful lesson that each one of us can take from this. Even when a Yid is found in a place of concealment and darkness. Do not get moved by this. This is really not a Hester. Bipnimius, this is above any concealment. It's connected. It's bekoichai, nit not zu beikum dem Hester. Not only could you overcome this Hester, no noch mehr zu übermachen dem Hester gufe le'or, but to actually transform the darkness itself into light. As the Rebbe explained before, that's what Shachar is all about, the break of dawn, the crack of dawn that breaks and transforms actually the darkness itself into light. And that's the power that every single Yid has when he finds himself in a place of Chayshach. So now the Rebbe will take what we learned over here and bring this to, as I mentioned, the first halacha in the Torah, in Shulchan Aruch, and also in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, something that we can learn from this regarding Shachar, regarding a person waking up every morning. A beautiful, beautiful inyan in the beginning of Shulchan Aruch. V'gerat fil mal. We already said many times, Zenen alle inyanim from Pnimius HaTeire da beremez akol panim in nigle de Teire. Everything that's hinted, that there is, in Pnimius HaTeire, is hinted in nigle. And azayach bin yanenu. Der inyan anal and avedus kolechad vechad. The point that we just mentioned. V'ayid is bipnimius hecher von Hester. That a yid is really higher than any concealment. Is that Alter Rebbe meramis in sein Shulchan Aruch b'madura tinyana in anib von Hilchas Hashkamas HaBaiker in dem din von ani ma'eir hashachar ve'ein hashachar meir oisi. And Alter Rebbe speaks about in the beginning of Hilchas Hashkamas HaBaiker, waking up in the morning. So the Alter Rebbe there brings what it says, that you wake up, you should wake up early enough that you awaken the dawn, and the dawn does not awaken you. You wake up when it's still dark outside. Und das ist verbunden, this inyan of what Alter Rebbe says is connected to mitatmiye in Taz, with a very strong question that there is, and something that the Taz says in the beginning of Shulchan Aruch. Und Ashina in Alten Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch from Madura Kama to Madura Tinyana. There's a change that Alter Rebbe makes between the two versions of what Alter Rebbe wrote. Is the Madura Kama, which is most of the Shulchan Aruch of the Alter Rebbe. Then the Alter Rebbe began writing the Shulchan Aruch in a second version, and there the Alter Rebbe changes a certain detail here in the beginning in the Shulchan Aruch. Was wird werden verstandig, and all this will be explained after we bring in the point that we spoke about before regarding what does Shachar, dawn, really represent in a person's Aveda. So let's begin. Der Torah bringt that up in ersten Simen von Eure Chaim. The Torah writes in the beginning, in the first Simen of Eure Chaim as follows. Tzarech ha'adam le'izgaber ka'ari. One must be strong like a lion. To get up in the morning to serve the Eibishter. And then he says, wake up early enough that you are awakening the dawn, and the dawn should not awaken you. David said, I still wake up when it's still dark, and I awaken the dawn, and the dawn does not awaken me. That's what it says in the Torah. In Shulchan Aruch, when this is quoted in Shulchan Aruch, bringt up the Mechaber nor den Anab. The Mechaber only quotes the first part of this statement. Sheyehehu ma'ered hashachar. Wake up early enough that you should awaken the dawn. On nitem siyum, he doesn't quote the conclusion. Ve'ein hashachar me'er oisi. That the dawn does not awaken me. So that's the change that we find between the Torah and the way the Mechaber brings it in Shulchan Aruch. Is Masber then Taz. So the Taz explains the reason for this. So here in the Taz, we'll see, what does this mean that I awaken the dawn? What does this mean? What is this dawn that I awaken and not the dawn awakens me? What does Shachar really represent? So he says, Shachar meant Knesses Kedushas Yisrael. Shachar refers to the holiness of Yidden. As we said before, Shachar refers to Sfiras HaMalchus, which is the place where all the neshamas of Yidden are gathered over there. So Shachar refers to the holiness and the Kedusha of the neshama of Yidden. The Kedusha versus Shaira in Yidden, the holiness that dwells within every single Yid. So what are we saying over here? When it comes to the neshama, to the holiness of a Yid, so there are two different ways here. Ani me'er hashachar, what does this mean? The Yisayirus mulmata, when a person works from below and does his Aveda himself from below, in order to come and to connect to the holiness of his neshama in the morning. So when it says Ani ma'eres hashachar, what it really means is, besides the literal pshat that you wake up early enough before the crack of dawn, but what it means is that you awaken yourself on your own and you connect on your own through your neshama that's above, to the holiness of your neshama. Shachar me'er oisi, other way around, which is that dawn awakens you. What does this represent? The Yisayirus milmayla from B'china Shachar, that there's that holiness of your neshama that comes from above, that awakens you to come and do your Aveda, to come and do what you have to. So there's basically in the Lashon that Chassidus usually brings a Serusa de Le'ela or a Serusa de L'Sata. Und das hat gemeint David ve'ein hashachar me'er oisi. When David the Melech said that I awaken the dawn, and the dawn does not awaken me, what was he saying? The Yisayirus shaloi mulmata. His awakening, his own Aveda from below, Gedayla kolkach, is so powerful, she'ein tzarech l'siyua his Yisayirus shel mayla. He doesn't need any assistance of the holiness of his neshama to shine into him from above, to give him any inspiration. He on his own from below does his Aveda complete and full, and he doesn't rely on any Yisayirus from above. So to be in such a level that you don't need any assistance from above is a unique level that's for people like David or the like. Brengt es nit the Mechaber in Shulchan Aruch. So therefore the Mechaber doesn't quote the second part in Shulchan Aruch that ve'ein hashachar me'er oisi, that I do not need the assistance of the holiness of my neshama from above, because this is not something that's for everybody that's learning the Shulchan Aruch. It's only for people that are on a level like David HaMelech. That's the pshat in the Taz explaining the diuk in the Shulchan Aruch, that he only brings the first part, sheyehehu ma'ered hashachar, that a person should awaken the dawn. But a person does also need the shachar to be ma'ered him, because a regular person does need the assistance of above. So the pshat of the Taz is very difficult to understand. Wie kemen sagen? How is it possible to say that there's a person that's on a level that doesn't need any help, any inspiration from above? Anybody, whoever it is, if the Eibusha does not assist you in your Avedis Hashem, then you're lost. You can't do it on your own. It says regarding every single Yid, including the greatest tzaddik, even like David HaMelech, never believe in yourself. There's nothing you can do on your own. You always rely on having the assistance from above. So how could the Taz explain that Ein Hashachar Me'er Oisi means I don't need the awakening, I don't need the inspiration from above, from Shachar, which is the revelation of the Kedusha from above. How could that be? Now let's look what the Alter Rebbe says in Shulchan Aruch. The Alter Rebbe Madure Kame brengt euch herab wie der Mechaber nor der Inyan von Yisheyehu Me'er HaShachar. In the Madure Kame, the Alter Rebbe quotes it like the Mechaber, only the first part, which is that you awaken the dawn. Aber in Madure Tinyana sagt Sheyehu Me'er HaShachar, you awaken the dawn, K'meshekasev ha'ira shachar, Ani ma'ered hashachar, ve'ein hashachar me'er oisi, I awaken the dawn does not awaken me, v'zu mida beinenis. And this is the average conduct of a person, that he wakes up at this time in the morning where he awakens the dawn, and the dawn does not awaken him. And the Alter Rebbe quotes the full statement like it's quoted in the Torah. Move on. So the question here is, the second version that the Alter Rebbe wrote is part of Shulchan Aruch. Something that's written average for every person to be able to fulfill. Was bringt dort Alter Rebbe dem Inyan von Ve'ena Shacha Meira, you see, was is Shaykh Nar LeDavid v'chayetze b'zeh. According to the Taz's Pshat, Ve'ena Shacha Meira, you see, that you don't rely on any inspiration from above is only for unique people, like David HaMelech. So why does Alter Rebbe quote this? The question is even greater. From the Hemshech Halosh from the Alter Rebbe is mashma. The continuation of what the Alter Rebbe says, it seems, as the Verte, V'zu Mida Beininus, when he says this is an average conduct of a person, but seeing sich, regarding what is the Alter Rebbe saying this? That this is the average conduct of a person. So the Rebbe says, Nit nor zu klolus hadin, he's not only saying this as far as the general halacha that he's saying here at the time of when a person should wake up, that you should wake up before it's light outside. Was kommt nicht zu dem, was is roy l'chol yirei shemayim lakim b'chatzayis halayla. In contrast to a person which is on a higher level, he is yirei shemayim, that he should get up at chatzayis. So when the Alter Rebbe says midah beininis, he's not only referring to the timing of when you should wake up in the morning. Naroich zu dem inyan von ve'ein hashacha meiraisi. On this, the Alter Rebbe writes, he's also saying that this is a midah beininis. Das heißt, es ist shaykh nit dafke zu yechidis gula. That the shachar not awakening you is not something which is for unique individuals like David HaMelech, like the Taz says. Not adarabah, zu midah beininis. It refers, this is an average midah for every person to say that I will awaken the dawn, and the dawn does not awaken me. So how could this be? According to the Pshat of the Taz, that's only shaykh to people that are on a very high level, that don't need the inspiration from above. So, Pianal, Sif Yud Gimel, and Madregas Shachar, based on what we learned before about what the word Shachar, dawn, what level does this really represent? As das is Knesset Yisrael Malchus, wie sie is yored in dem Helem ve Esther von Olam. It refers specifically to the level of Malchus when it comes down into the concealment of the world. Kemen sage, and we could explain all of this as follows. Das was der Taz sagt, ein tzarich l'siyua, his oireres shel maila, that when it says ein hashacha moire reisi, it means that he doesn't need any inspiration from above. Meint blois as darf nicht ankommen zu der Siyua, was nimmt sich vom Bchinas Shachar. What he's saying is that this individual does not need any assistance, any inspiration that comes from the level of Shachar. As the Rebbe will soon explain, the level of Shachar, which is this sphere of Malchus. He doesn't rely on an inspiration from here, from the level of Shachar. Darf aber ankommen zu a Siyua von hechere Madregis and Elakos. He's on a higher level, and of course he relies on inspiration of above. Nobody does anything on his own without any help from above. However, there's different madregas from where you get your Hesayres Momaila. When it says, Ein HaShachar Ma'ored Oisi, it means that I'm not getting my inspiration from the level of Shachar, rather I'm getting, because I'm on a higher level, I'm getting my inspiration from an even higher place. A higher level of Nelikus. As the Rebbe will explain now, 3 different levels corresponding to a Tzaddik and a Beinani and a Rasha. The explanation here is as follows. In dem Siyua, Mulmaila, Yeshloimar, Zenefaran, Bechlol is drei Madreges. As far as the inspiration and the assistance that the Eibishter gives a person in his Avedis Hashem, we could divide this in general into 3 levels. Aleph, the Siyua, as Muzolid Nichshol werden in Taivis Isser Rachman al-Islam. The assistance for a person that's in a place where he struggles with Inyanim of Isser, and the Eibishter helps him to overcome his desires in areas of Isser. Und der Siyua is from Bchinas Shachar. This is what Shachar represents. Having the assistance for things that are prohibited, and a person is struggling with this. Vi Malchus, as we said before, Shachar is connected to Malchus, kumt darab in soif kol halayla. Malchus, as it comes down in the lowest darkness of the night, that art von tachlis a hester von olam hazeh, the place of the absolute darkness of the world, that's where the inspiration of Shachar comes to. That's one level of inspiration, Shachar. Based on another level, the Siyua, as man soll sich aushitten von Taivis Heter. Then you have the assistance and the inspiration for a person that's struggling with Taivis Heter, to help him be careful not to get involved in and indulging in his own personal Taivis. Und das kommt von Malchus, wie sie wird atek lebrie. This is assistance that comes from the level of Malchus, which is out of Atzilus already, but not invested within the lowest darkness of Biyah, but Malchus being the source of revelation that will come into Bria. Was Chotsch, als euch die beginne, is an inje von Laila, Yeride in Eilam is Biyah. This is a level of Malchus that is already related to darkness. It's not within Atzilus. Und al derech sein Aveide kommt es doch zu verhitten von Taivis. This relates to a person that struggles with his own personal desires and indulgence, which is not proper. It is aber nicht safe kol halayla. We're not talking about an inspiration that's needed for the lowest darkness. The siyua is of Taivis heter. This is helping a person and overcome his struggles in areas that are permitted. That's the second level of a person and the second level of inspiration regarding this person. Gimel, der siyua of kenen oile zayin mi madrege le madrege in kedusha gufa. A person that doesn't struggle not with Taivis Isser, not in Taivis Eter, and he's getting an inspiration and a help from above to grow and go from level to level within holiness. Und das kommt von Malchus da Atzilus, wie sie ist, b'mekayma in Atzilus. The inspiration for this comes from Malchus within the world of Atzilus. Was dann wird sie angerufen Yoim, Malchus, within the world of Atzilus, which is a place of revelation, a place where God's unity is recognized there. This is where Malchus is referred to as day, the daylight that is ma'eded a person in his Avedis Hashem. Those are the three sources, the three levels of people, and the three sources of inspiration that come from above. The drei inyanim anal zana masim b'chalolus, the drei madreges in Aveda. These three levels are fitting to the three levels in a person's Aveda, Avedas HaTzadik, HaBeinini, und HaRosha. Wie madregasen wird erklärt in Tanya, as these three levels are explained in Tanya. A Tzadik is in ganzen nicht shaykh zu inyanim von Taivis. A Tzadik, as Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, is not only a person that doesn't do Avedas or a person that's mostly mitzvahs, but a person that's completely removed of any trace of any desire even for anything of an Aveda. Was nimmt sich von Nefesh Bahamis, which its source comes from the selfishness of the Nefesh Bahamis. By a Tzadik, none of that exists. Und sein Aveda besteht in Aliyah, in Kedusha, Gufa. He's just going higher and higher within holiness. That's the level of a Tzadik, the highest level that we mentioned before, the third level. By a Beinini is abgefragt zu tun an Aveda, Rachmanu Litzlan. A Beinini is an individual that it's out of the question of actually doing an Aveda. Right now, he's in a condition that it's so out of the question that in his mindset now, he'll never do an Aveda in his life. However, he does struggle internally. There are taivis that come up to his mind and he has to push them out and he has to deal with certain taivis that are there internally. Then you have the third category, the Rasha, that's struggling with things that are prohibited. It's the Rasha that has to have the assistance that comes from the level of Shachar that relates to a person that's in Seif Kol HaLayla, the person that's struggling with the real darkness that exists in this world. Now we'll understand beautifully the difference between the way the Alter Rebbe brings this concept in the Madura Kama of Shulchan Aruch and the way he brings it in the Madura Tinyana. Mitzad Nigla de Teira. Looking at the perspective of things from Nigla. Is a Beinini, so how do we define a Beinini in the simple pshat of a Beinini before you come to Tanya? Is a Beinini dervas is mechza al mechza. A Beinini is an individual that the scale by him is half and half mitzvahs and half the opposite. Dervas hat mer from mechza. Roiv zachiyos is a tzaddik. In the simple pshat in Allah and Nigla, one that has mostly mitzvahs is already a tzaddik. Und der Rebbe in Madura Kama in the first version of the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. Was ist geschrieben geworden, Leute Hachra von Gemara und Paiskim, where the Alter Rebbe writes the halachas relying on the way things are explained and in the Gemara and in the Paiskim, in other words, the angle and the perspective of Nigla, bringt nicht the Alter Rebbe der Inyan von Ve'ena Shacha Meiraisi. The Alter Rebbe does not quote the conclusion of the statement that I don't need an assistance from the level of Shachar. As man darf nicht ankommen zum Siyua von Shachar, was hit up von Oiver sein an Aveda, that protects a person of not being Oiver an Aveda. Because over here, the Alter Rebbe is talking about a Beinini. And who's the Beinini? The Beinini is a person in the Nigla, a Beinini is a person that is struggling with Avedas. And therefore the Alter Rebbe can't conclude that this person doesn't need an assistance from the level of Shachar. He does. He needs that assistance of the level of Shachar to help him, to be careful, not to be Oiver an Aveda. That's in the Madura Kama. In the Madura Tinyana, had the Alter Rebbe machriya gewen, Kama Kubalim. The Alter Rebbe, when it comes to questions where there's a machlokes between the Paiskim and the Mukubalim, the Alter Rebbe leans more towards the Mukubalim. So looking at things from the perspective of Pnimiyus HaTorah is Oicha Beinani Nitshayach Tzoiv Zayin and Aveda. So who's a Beinani in the Pshat that Alter Rebbe says in Tanya? A Beinani is an individual that's out of the question, any Aveda. Obemele darfen it is a Yua from Bchinas Shachar. So therefore every Beinani, not only David HaMelech, but every Beinani is on the level that he does not need the assistance from the level of Shachar that's there to inspire a Yid that's struggling with Avedis. Und der Fahr bringt der Alter Rebbe dort euch der Minium von Veina Shachar Meiresi. So therefore the Alter Rebbe does quote that for a Beinani, he does not rely on the inspiration that comes from Shachar, on his Messiah. And the Alter Rebbe actually says, V'zu midde Beinenes. This is the mid of a Beinani. Was the mid is a Meramis, so the beginner from Beinani. The Alter Rebbe is hinting to the level of a Beinani, the average, the Beinani, in the interpretation of Tanya and Pnimiyus HaTorah, that refers to a person that does not need this Eidus of Shachar, because it's out of the question for him to do any Aveda. Und das Gufe stellt rein der Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch als Psak Din, was is Shavuot L'chol Nefesh. The Alter Rebbe places this in the Shulchan Aruch, which is an actual Psak Din for every person. Weil noch dem, was the Alter Rebbe hat Megale gewinnt in Tanya, the Amit is Inyan HaBeinani. Once the Alter Rebbe revealed to us in Tanya what's the true level of a Beinani, is doch das geworden mit das Kol Adam. This itself, through the Alter Rebbe writing and explaining this, the Alter Rebbe empowered us, and this became the level for every person. V'achrea kol adam yimshech shekol adam yachaliyah is beinani b'choleis u'b'chol shah. That every person could be on the level of beinani. The way the Alter Rebbe explains it in Tanya, that every moment that it should be out of the question to do any aveda. By the Alter Rebbe explaining it, this itself revealed this inyan. Until the Alter Rebbe wrote this, it wasn't necessarily Shavuot L'chol Nefesh to be on the level of a Beinani of Tanya. But the Alter Rebbe is writing and letting us know and revealing what the emissary level of a Beinani, this itself actually draws down the power and empowers us to be able to be a Beinani. There in Yanal, Mont Alter Rebbe gleich b'ashkomas habayker. Where is this brought in Shulchan Aruch? This is brought in Shulchan Aruch right when you wake up in the morning. Afilu fara miras meidani. Actually, even before the halacha about saying meidani. Das heißt, what this means is, oich wenn es noch nicht da kein gili urban afshay. Right at the beginning of the morning. There's no revelation yet. You didn't even say meidani yet. Needless to say, you didn't daven and no other mitzvah yet. It says, beim nach hamatza von choshech. You're coming directly from the darkness of the night. Manzich von him. What do we demand from a yid as soon as he wakes up? Le'izgaber al yitzrei ka'ari. To be strong like a lion against your Yetzirah. Ba'efen as darf nicht ankommen afüllt zu siyuam al maila if nicht over sein an avere rachman al-itzlan. Ein ha-shacha mei reisi. And the strength of a yid, even then, is so powerful that you don't even need the assistance from being over an avere. That's out of the question. How could you demand of a yid this? And even when a yid that's coming directly from the darkness of night, how can we say that every yid, every average yid, a Beinani, is on the level that he doesn't need the assistance to help him to be careful from an Aveda? Isn't he in a place of darkness? Is there beer in them? Das, was a Yid is in a matzah von choshech, is es nor mitzad sein chitzonius. The way we view ourselves, if a person views himself that choshech defines who he is and the place that he's in, that's only if you're looking at things externally. So then, he might need the help and the assistance from Shachar. But Pnimiyus is a hecha from them Esther. However, Pnimiyus, who is a Yid? Pnimiyus, a Yid is higher than this Esther. Ukanal sif yudalad binyan hadasa hi Esther. That really a Yid is higher from this entire choshech, completely removed, and he doesn't have to be in a spar from this choshech at all. V'adarabe, der matzav von Hester. It's the matzav of the Hester itself that you find yourself in. Ruf tarois the pnimiyus haneshama b'yesaseis v'yesaraz. Not only do you not have to be in the spall of the darkness and know what your true identity is, but it's this Helen v'Hester itself that awakens within a yid to draw out deeper powers of your soul. Was tritt zu heißen dem koyach hamesiris nefesh, was is da by jeden yid, which is the koyach hamesiris nefesh that comes out by every single yid in such kind of situations. This is given b'mei Esther, and as it was in the times of Esther and the time of Purim, as b'meshach kol hashana kula, for about an entire year. They stood with Mesiris Nefesh every day, every hour, every moment, not knowing what's going to be with them, what their fate will be. And nevertheless, they stood strong with Mesiris Nefesh. What this means is that Mesiris Nefesh is something that permeates every part of the person. In Allah seine Keiches und Afile b'levusha achitzainim. And the Mesiris Nefesh, the Keich and Mesiris Nefesh of a Yid, empowers a Yid and influences even his most external behavior. And this is the lesson, and this is true for the Aveda of every single Yid. Dafke, der Matze von Choshech. It's specifically if you see that you are in a place of Choshech. Don't become demoralized. On the contrary, Ruf da reis pnimius nafshay noch mer vira Matze von Gilead. This itself calls out and is ma'ated by you deeper powers, deeper revelation, even more than when you're in a place of revelation. Und das direkt sich in Kabbalah Soil von Etzem HaNeshama. This is expressed by the power of Kabbalah Soil that every Yid has. It comes from the essence of your soul. Was nimmt dem durch im Ganzen, that permeates you completely, was mitzadem, and because of this, Yochel Liya is Beinani, as the Alter Rebbe writes, every single Yid can live up to be a Beinani, as Beinani is explained in Tanya, b'choleis, every single moment, u'b'chol shah, every single hour, every single time in the day.